18th-century fortunes were the product of a rigid formula, a classical education, decades of calculated strategy, and a meticulous understanding of global shipping. This was a world where immense wealth was the exclusive reward for the intellectual elite. The map of the 18th-century New England colonies shows the landscape of this closed economy. Along this coast, trade was a game of pedigree. Entering high society required an Ivy League background and the social capital to navigate the complex logistics of international commerce. Timothy Dexter was the complete opposite of that world. Born to a poor family in 1747, he dropped out of school at 8 to work in the fields. By 14, he was an apprentice in the leather tanning industry. In this pocket of Massachusetts, Dexter was destined for a life of manual labor, soaking animal hides in vats of urine. Yet Dexter possessed a massive, entirely unearned sense of ambition. He was functionally illiterate and lacked any social standing, yet he fully expected to be recognized as a wealthy gentleman. Class mobility required capital, which he obtained by marrying Elizabeth Frothin M., a widow who already owned property and a home. In 1769, he moved his wife's fortune to Newburyport. This was one of the wealthiest shipping hubs in America, and Dexter, an uneducated tanner, was dropping himself directly into the epicenter of the colonial elite. This created a volatile scenario. We have to look at what happens when a man with no financial literacy gets just enough money to start gambling in the world of high finance. Dexter's first major move was to take his capital and buy up massive piles of continental currency. This is a $5 bill of continental currency. The Continental Congress printed these notes to fund the Revolutionary War, but they weren't backed by gold or silver. They were essentially IOUs backed by the hope that the colonies would actually win the war and eventually find a way to pay the debt. This chart shows the value of continental currency over time. Because Congress printed money to keep the war effort alive, hyperinflation took hold. The value crashed so severely that not worth a continental became a standard insult for anything worthless. Newburyport's established merchants spent their days purging their ledgers of the currency, desperate to unload it at any price. Dexter spent his days doing the opposite, trading his real gold and silver for wheelbarrows full of the worthless paper. According to every known law of 18th century economics, this was a disaster. Dexter was trading a tangible fortune for literal trash, positioning himself for immediate and total bankruptcy. Then the external world shifted. Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, convinced the federal government to assume all state debts. Crucially, his plan involved redeeming continental currency at face value to establish the nation's credit. Overnight, Dexter's mountains of worthless paper became legally redeemable for actual gold and silver. This data compares standard colonial trade profits with the return on Dexter's currency hoarding. A successful merchant voyage might yield a respectable margin, but Dexter's ROI was astronomical. He bought currency for fractions of a cent and cashed it in for full value. The elite shipping magnates who had mocked Dexter for months realized the man they considered a fool was now one of the wealthiest in the state. This was the birth of the Dexter method, a complete bypass of market strategy in favor of sheer, uncalculated luck. Dexter used his wealth to fund a lifestyle of increasing absurdity. He bought a mansion, filled the grounds with dozens of giant wooden statues of historical figures, including a statue of himself, and hired a personal poet to sing his praises. Dexter's wealth served as a megaphone for his absurdity. As his bank account ballooned, the doors of high society slammed shut. The local elite revolted by a man who still smelled of animal hides and spoke with the vocabulary of a child. Timothy Dexter serves as a direct challenge to the idea of a meritocracy. He demonstrates that intelligence and hard work are sometimes irrelevant to success. Strategy and logic are the preferred tools for building a fortune, but the history of wealth is often dictated by the terrifying power of being in the right place with a remarkably stupid idea. The American Revolutionary War was over, but the soldiers returning home found themselves walking into an economic void. The newly independent states had virtually no gold or silver. To keep the army fed and equipped during the fighting, the Continental Congress had resorted to a stopgap measure. They paid their troops in newly printed paper money, known as continental currency. This note is a $55 continental. If you read the text, it explicitly promises the bearer 55 Spanish milled dollars, meaning physical silver. But that promise was hollow. The newly formed government held zero precious metal reserves. They were issuing IOUs on an empty vault. This chart tracks the purchasing power of the continental dollar against gold. Between 1776 and 1780, the value of this paper dropped so sharply it essentially hit zero. Everyday commerce choked because the money depreciated daily. The inflation was so severe that the phrase "not worth a continental" became a common insult. Desperate citizens and veterans began offloading their paychecks, selling them for mere pennies on the dollar to anyone willing to take them. Dumping this currency was the most rational financial decision a person could make at the time. The market had reached a universal consensus. The continental dollar was dead. But localized economies sometimes ignore macroeconomic logic. Here in the coastal colonial town of Newburyport, Massachusetts, one man looked at the panic and decided to go the other way. Timothy Dexter was an uneducated leather tanner with no formal financial training. He looked at the same dying currency everyone else did, but he saw an opportunity. While savvy investors stayed as far away as possible, Dexter actively sought out desperate veterans. He offered them fractions of a penny for their notes, scooping up every piece of rough paper he could find. He took his own earnings and then drained his wife's substantial life savings, pouring every cent of hard currency they had into an asset the entire country had abandoned. Dexter's buying spree resulted in an absurd physical accumulation. He amassed literal wooden chests in his home, packed to the brim with universally despised paper. His neighbors watched him trade actual wealth for trash and openly mocked him in the streets. To the people of Newburyport, he was the town idiot. The prevailing social agreement was absolute. Everyone around Dexter believed he had permanently ruined his family by squandering a comfortable living on a delusion. Traditional financial literacy dictates cutting your losses when an asset's underlying value evaporates. Dexter did the opposite, driven by a blind stubbornness rather than any readable market data. Under the established rules of the early American economy, his gamble was a measurable, catastrophic failure. The paper sat rotting in his parlor, holding absolutely zero purchasing power. Then the legal framework of the country shifted entirely. The ratification of the United States Constitution dissolved the old Confederation and established a highly centralized federal government. This new government required a functional financial system to operate. Alexander Hamilton was appointed as the very first Secretary of the Treasury, tasked with building that system from the ground up. Hamilton faced an immediate crisis. For the young United States to survive on the global stage, it desperately needed to establish international credit. Foreign nations needed to trust that America paid its debts. This diagram shows Hamilton's solution. He proposed the federal government absorb all worthless continental debt, redeeming it at face value for new federal bonds. By applying its full faith and credit, Hamilton created value out of thin air. The taxable institution stabilized the notes. This single policy pivot inverted the definition of a bond investment. Almost overnight, fiat paper that had been written off as a total loss was transformed back into a guaranteed commodity. Hamilton's decision to redeem the old debt traveled from the capital to the coastal towns, reaching the wooden chests sitting in Timothy Dexter's home. The notes Dexter had purchased for fractions of a penny were redeemable for their printed value. He traded his piles of rough paper for immense amounts of real, heavy gold. The residents of Newburyport, who had spent years laughing at Dexter's trash, watched as those chests were emptied for gold, making him, by any objective measure, one of the wealthiest men in the state. This fortune was the result of a single-minded refusal to sell. While the entire country followed the logical trend toward liquidation, Dexter's inability to grasp the danger kept his assets intact. History's most legendary financial windfalls are rarely the result of superior intellect. They happen when a stubborn refusal to follow logic meets an absolute, total structural rewrite of a nation's financial system. In the late 18th century, Newburyport, Massachusetts, was a rigid epicenter of colonial commerce. It was a town built by merchant elites who treated international trade as a strict, predictable science. Then there was Timothy Dexter. He was completely uneducated, incredibly loud, and had just stumbled into a massive fortune by buying up severely depreciated continental currency right before the government made good on it. To the conservative, meticulously calculating merchants of the town, commerce had rules. Dexter ignored all of them. He bumbled into their high society wearing gaudy, mismatched silk suits, acting as a walking insult to their refined sensibilities. The elites of Newburyport decided that shutting him out of their social clubs wasn't enough. They wanted to orchestrate his financial ruin and mathematically prove his stupidity to the world. Their strategy was clever. They began feeding Dexter terrible business advice that sounded perfectly logical on paper, but was designed to guarantee total bankruptcy when applied in the real world. They were operating on what we can call the smart money fallacy. They believed their expertise gave them the power to perfectly predict and control the chaotic variables of the global market. The merchants kicked off their campaign by convincing Dexter to buy up thousands of pairs of thick wool mittens and ship them to the tropical island of Jamaica. The logic behind the prank was airtight. Jamaica is consistently hot. No one living in the Caribbean has ever needed winter gear. If you map this out, you see a trade route carrying freezing weather apparel into a tropical climate zone. Based on local temperatures, the demand for this inventory plunges straight to zero. But the merchants failed to account for a completely random variable. Right as Dexter's cargo ship dropped anchor in Jamaica, a Swedish merchant fleet arrived in the exact same port. Those Swedish ships were ultimately bound for Russia. They desperately needed warm gear for the brutal Baltic winter, and happily bought out Dexter's entire inventory of mittens at a massive premium. This historical image shows the harbor at Port Royal, Jamaica. Notice the sheer density of international shipping traffic. Major ports are massive collision points for global trade, making these statistically unlikely intersections entirely possible. The Newburyport elites made a static assumption. They looked only at the destination, completely ignoring the dynamic, interconnected web of international shipping lanes, where needs overlap constantly. Frustrated but determined, the merchants tried another angle. They told Dexter to ship a massive load of coal to Newcastle, England. At the time, Newcastle was the absolute global leader in coal production. Sending coal there was the literal equivalent of trying to sell sand in the Sahara. Yet again, they missed a critical timing variable. Dexter's ship arrived exactly as the local Newcastle miners initiated a massive labor strike. The coal capital of the world was suddenly experiencing a desperate shortage, allowing Dexter to sell his cargo for huge profits. The elites scrambled. They told him to gather up stray cats and ship them to the Caribbean. He did, and he arrived right as the local plantation owners were fighting off a massive plague of rats, instantly creating a high-priced market for natural predators. Finally, they convinced him to export warming pans, metal devices meant to be filled with hot coals and slipped under freezing bedsheets, straight to the tropics. Look closely at this historical warming pan. Notice the ornate, circular, bowl-like basin and the short, sturdy handle attached to the rim. The Caribbean locals completely ignored the intended heating function. They saw the wide basin and long handle and bought out Dexter's entire supply to use as ladles and skimmers for the booming local molasses industry. The elites assume products have fixed purposes. In reality, human adaptability allows people to find immediate, bizarre utility in whatever resources arrive on their shores. By the end of this campaign of sabotage, Timothy Dexter was unfathomably wealthy. He outcompeted the very establishment figures who spent years trying to ruin him. The so-called smart money relied on brittle, rigid logic. Every time their perfectly constructed theories faced a collision with actual reality, the theories shattered, leaving room for a chaotic variable to generate profit. Deep expertise frequently creates massive blind spots. Experts start to assume the world operates in an orderly, predictable manner, simply because they understand the theoretical rules. But in a deeply chaotic global system, full of strikes, migrating fleets, and random shortages, being lucky and highly mobile often yields better results than being brilliant but utterly rigid. Timothy Dexter's success serves as a humbling reminder that sometimes the people who know exactly how everything is supposed to work are the only ones who can't see the world for the profitable, beautiful mess it actually is. Most historical legacies are built on a specific foundation: profound brilliance, statesmanship, or artistic mastery. We tend to view history as a record of these qualities, but occasionally the standard cracks. Timothy Dexter was an uneducated leather tanner from Massachusetts. By every conventional metric of the 18th century, he lacked the breeding, the education, and the temperament to be remembered by anyone. Yet Dexter ended his life surrounded by monuments of his own making, having secured the type of public mourning and literary recognition usually reserved for the era's great thinkers. How does a man whose greatest intellectual contribution was a book without punctuation manage to bypass the traditional requirements of fame? Dexter's story suggests that history isn't always a strict meritocracy. Sometimes it leaves room for a figure who operates entirely outside the logic of the time. Dexter decided that if the social hierarchy wouldn't invite him in, he would simply rewrite his own status. He bypassed the entire concept of hereditary nobility by declaring himself Lord Timothy Dexter. He spent his wealth turning his estate into a physical manifestation of this new status, erecting 40 giant wooden statues of the world's most famous men across his grounds. He didn't just admire these figures, he inserted himself among them. By placing his own wooden likeness alongside George Washington and Napoleon, he forced a visual association between himself and genuine historical weight. To complete the illusion of a royal court, he hired a local fish peddler named Jonathan Plummer to serve as his personal jester, paying him to write poems that praised Dexter's supposed intellect. Through this constructed environment, Dexter lived within a reality of his own making, one where he was immune to the dismissal of the actual upper class. In 1802, Dexter attempted to solidify his intellectual standing by publishing a book of his personal philosophy called A Pickle for the Knowing Ones. The book was a linguistic nightmare. It featured no capital letters, no punctuation, and a style of phonetic spelling that made it nearly impossible for a standard reader to follow. Across the pages, Dexter aired a long list of grievances, venting his frustrations with politicians, the church, and the behavior of his wife. Critics and scholars naturally mocked the first edition, dismissing it as the work of an illiterate eccentric. Dexter responded to the mockery in his second edition. At the very back, he added an entire page consisting of nothing but punctuation marks. He included a note telling his critics to pepper and salt the text with the punctuation however they liked. By leaning into his own technical failures, Dexter turned a widely mocked book into a strange, interactive statement that left his detractors with nothing left to criticize. Dexter eventually became preoccupied with how he would be remembered after he was gone. To see his own legacy in action, he decided to fake his own death. He staged a massive, expensive funeral at his mansion, successfully drawing a crowd of thousands to pay their respects. Most of those attendees weren't there to mourn. They were there for the free alcohol Dexter had promised to anyone who showed up. While the crowd gathered, Dexter hid in his basement, watching the entire performance through the floorboards to gauge the public's reaction. The event ended in a characteristically dark fashion. Dexter emerged from hiding and physically struck his wife because he felt her mourning wasn't convincing enough. This fake funeral was a final attempt to witness his own historical impact, trying to observe the narrative of his life while he was still alive to hear it. Timothy Dexter passed away for real in 1806, leaving behind a legacy that remains one of the most confusing chapters in New England's history. His life complicates the idea that success is always the result of careful planning or intellectual rigor. Dexter serves as a reminder that the world doesn't always follow a predictable, merit-based path. In his case, a total, unwavering confidence in his own importance acted as an effective substitute for any actual talent or training. Lord Timothy Dexter wasn't a misunderstood genius. He was a man who moved through life with such specific, chaotic energy that he became the exception to almost every rule of historical success.